Mediterranean ancestry. Mediterranean ancestry spans the sunlit coasts of southern Europe, the Levant, and North Africa, regions shaped by early agriculture, dense cities, and centuries of infectious pressure. Life in these environments forged a distinctive genetic landscape, one tuned to malaria, famine, and epidemic disease long before modern medicine arrived. Several hidden disadvantages emerged from these ancient defenses. Traits like beta thalassemia and G6PD deficiency spread because they disrupted malaria's life cycle inside red blood cells. Yet outside that context, they reveal costs: chronic anemia, deadly food allergies, and dangerous medication reactions. Similarly, mutations behind familial Mediterranean fever likely sharpened immune vigilance against historic plagues, but now trigger painful, recurring inflammation that requires lifelong management. Other trade-offs are quieter. Lower lactose tolerance reflects dairy practices centered on fermentation rather than fresh milk. Variants affecting skin pigmentation, while subtle, can increase vulnerability to ultraviolet damage under intense Mediterranean sun. Each reflects adaptation to a precise historical niche. Mediterranean genetics tell a story of survival through adversity, but when threats fade, the protections they shaped remain, sometimes as burdens, echoing battles no longer fought. East Asian ancestry. East Asian ancestry encompasses populations shaped by long agricultural histories, dense settlements, and stable regional ecosystems across China, Korea, Japan, and neighboring regions. Over centuries, these societies adapted genetically to rice-based diets, endemic pathogens, and localized environmental pressures, producing distinctive metabolic and immune traits. Some of these adaptations reveal hidden disadvantages in the modern world. A well-known example is the ALDH2 enzyme variant, common in East Asians, which causes alcohol flushing by allowing toxic acetaldehyde to accumulate. While this once discouraged excessive drinking, repeated exposure today quietly increases the risk of esophageal cancer. Similarly, certain HLA immune gene variants, refined by evolution to fight regional infections, can dangerously overreact to modern pharmaceuticals, triggering severe reactions like Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Other vulnerabilities emerge at the intersection of genes and environment. Limited lactose digestion reflects ancestral diets without dairy, now clashing with modern food systems. Genetic susceptibility to eye elongation, once harmless, combines with intense near-work and low sunlight to fuel widespread myopia. Even cancer risks, such as nasopharyngeal carcinoma, trace back to immune trade-offs in controlling ancient viruses. What once ensured survival now demands careful navigation. East Asian ancestry illustrates how evolutionary success can carry quiet costs when the world changes faster than genes can follow. Balkan ancestry. Balkan ancestry reflects a crossroads of civilizations shaped by Slavic migrations, Mediterranean influence, and centuries of life in rugged, mountainous terrain. Geography fragmented populations into isolated valleys and villages, where small communities persisted for generations with limited outside mixing. This history left a genetic landscape rich in diversity at the regional level, yet unusually concentrated within local enclaves. Several hidden disadvantages arise from this pattern. Malaria once reached Balkan wetlands, favoring the spread of thalassemia traits and, at lower levels, sickle cell variants. These genes protected carriers, but still carry the risk of severe inherited anemia when combined. Isolation also amplified chance mutations. Founder effects caused rare recessive disorders to become unexpectedly common in specific ethnic or village groups, from metabolic conditions to childhood muscular dystrophies. Endogamy, when two people from the same small community have children, further increased the likelihood that silent mutations would meet. In some rural communities, this raised rates of congenital deafness and developmental disorders. Other vulnerabilities were tightly bound to place itself. Genetic sensitivity to local environmental toxins contributed to Balkan endemic nephropathy, a kidney disease once confined to particular farming regions. Balkan genetics reveal how history can narrow choice. When populations remain small and still, chance leaves a heavier mark, turning geography into destiny and inheritance into an echo of long-forgotten isolation. Hispanic and Latino ancestries. Hispanic and Latino ancestries arise from one of history's most complex genetic intersections. Indigenous American lineages, shaped by ancient migration into the Americas, later blended with European and African genes after the 15th century. This admixture produced extraordinary biological diversity, but also layered adaptations forged for radically different worlds. Some inherited traits reflect survival under scarcity. Metabolic variants that once conserved energy during feast and famine cycles now operate in environments of constant abundance, increasing vulnerability to type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Similar evolutionary logic appears in cholesterol metabolism. Genes that efficiently reclaim cholesterol on low-fat ancestral diets now predispose many to gallstones when paired with modern nutrition. Other disadvantages stem from chance rather than adaptation. High frequencies of folate processing variants can raise the risk of neural tube defects without sufficient dietary folate. In isolated communities, founder mutations, such as those behind Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome in Puerto Rico, amplified rare disorders through generations. Even diversity itself carries consequences. Highly mixed immune gene profiles can make finding compatible bone marrow donors more difficult. Admixture tells a story of resilience and survival across continents, yet it also reveals how genetic richness, when placed in new conditions, can quietly complicate modern health in unexpected ways. West African ancestry. West African ancestry emerges from some of humanity's most ancient and genetically diverse populations, shaped by tropical climates, intense sunlight, and relentless infectious pressure. For thousands of years, survival in this environment demanded biological defenses that were powerful, efficient, and often uncompromising. Many of those defenses reveal sharp trade-offs. The sickle cell mutation spread widely because a single copy dramatically reduced childhood death from malaria, even though inheriting 2 copies causes a severe, life-shortening blood disorder. A similar pattern appears in the APOL1 gene. Variants that protect against deadly sleeping sickness now greatly increase the risk of kidney failure in modern settings, where the original threat has receded. Other disadvantages surface through environmental change. Genetic tendencies towards salt retention, once life-saving under heat, dehydration, and illness, now contribute to earlier and more severe hypertension. Widespread lactose non-persistence reflects historical diets without dairy, while ancient adaptations that once boosted the immune system against tropical parasites may now predispose these lineages to higher rates of autoimmune inflammation and systemic lupus. West African genetics reflect adaptation under extreme pressure. They testify to survival against forces that killed without mercy. Yet when those forces fade, the traits they shaped can linger as burdens, revealing how evolution optimizes for survival, not comfort, longevity, or modern health. Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry reflects a historically small, tightly knit population shaped by repeated bottlenecks and centuries of endogamy in Central and Eastern Europe. This genetic isolation allowed rare recessive mutations to drift to high frequency, creating one of the most distinctive inherited risk profiles known in human populations. Several disorders illustrate this pattern: Tay-Sachs disease, Canavan disease, familial dysautonomia, and Gaucher disease all arise from missing enzymes or disrupted neural development, often appearing in infancy or early childhood despite normal birth. These conditions did not spread because they were beneficial, but because founder mutations were amplified as the population rapidly expanded. Some hypotheses suggest carriers may have had partial resistance to infections like tuberculosis in crowded medieval cities, though this remains uncertain. Cancer risk represents another significant hidden disadvantage. Ashkenazi Jews have elevated rates of hereditary breast, ovarian, prostate, and pancreatic cancers, largely driven by founder mutations in BRCA1 and 2. Roughly 1 in 40 individuals carries a BRCA mutation, about 10 times higher than in the general population, leading to earlier onset and more aggressive disease patterns. Ashkenazi genetics reveal the cost of historical survival under constraint, resilience preserved through continuity, accompanied by a concentration of biological vulnerabilities that modern screening and medicine can now help manage. Southeast Asian ancestry. Southeast Asian ancestry comes from regions with long histories of farming, trade, and close-knit communities. Over many generations, people in places like Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia developed certain inherited traits that are still common today. Some of these traits are harmless on their own, but can become serious under certain conditions. One example is hemoglobin E, a very common blood trait in this region. By itself, it usually causes only mild anemia. But if a child inherits hemoglobin E along with another blood disorder called beta thalassemia, the result can be a severe illness that requires lifelong medical care. A related condition, called alpha thalassemia, can also become life-threatening when several altered genes are inherited together. Carriers remain healthy, yet the combined inheritance patterns create significant medical burden. Another inherited trait, called G6PD deficiency, affects how red blood cells handle stress. Certain medicines or illnesses can trigger sudden anemia, which can be life-threatening. In some Southeast Asian communities, a rare heart rhythm condition called sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome can cause sudden death during sleep that disproportionately affects young men. There is also a higher rate of a specific cancer behind the nose linked to a common virus and certain traditional preserved foods. These patterns show how inherited traits can stay quiet for generations until the right combination brings them into focus. Indigenous American ancestry. Indigenous American ancestry traces to the first peoples who crossed into the Americas more than 15,000 years ago and then lived in near total isolation from the Old World. Over millennia, indigenous societies adapted to diverse landscapes, Arctic tundra, high mountains, dense forests, while remaining untouched by Eurasian pathogens, domesticated animals, and dairy-based diets. This long isolation carried a devastating hidden cost. Without generations of exposure to Old World diseases, indigenous immune systems lacked protective variants against illnesses like smallpox and measles. When these pathogens arrived, entire communities were overwhelmed, leading to catastrophic population collapse. Survival was not a failure of biology, but the absence of evolutionary rehearsal. Later, population bottlenecks reshaped immune genes, leaving lasting imprints on health. Other disadvantages emerged as environments changed. Metabolic traits that once preserved energy during famine now contribute to extreme rates of diabetes, fatty liver disease, and gallstones. Nearly universal lactose intolerance reflects ancestral diets without dairy, while shifts toward modern foods reveal vulnerabilities never tested before. Indigenous American genetics tell a story of extraordinary endurance, yet they also reveal how isolation, once protective, can become a liability when history abruptly rewrites the rules of survival. Arctic and Inuit ancestry. Arctic and Inuit ancestry reflects one of humanity's most extreme experiments in adaptation. Life above the polar circle demanded survival through cold, darkness, and diets built almost entirely from animal fat. Over thousands of years, powerful genetic changes emerged, efficient, specialized, and unforgiving. Some of these adaptations carry sharp hidden risks. Variants in fat metabolism genes, such as CPT1A, optimized energy use on a high-fat diet and supported endurance through long winters. Yet in infants, the same change can impair the ability to generate ketones during fasting, making them vulnerable to sudden drops in blood sugar without warning. Other metabolic adaptations reshaped fatty acid processing, lowering cholesterol, and protecting against heart disease, but also subtly limiting growth and stature. Skin pigmentation tells a similar story. Arctic peoples relied on vitamin D from marine foods rather than sunlight, allowing darker skin to persist at high latitudes. When traditional diets fade, this coupling breaks, revealing deficiencies never faced before. Even cold tolerance traits that maintain circulation may raise blood pressure in modern indoor environments. Arctic genetics reveal evolution at its most precise. When conditions remain constant, the system works beautifully. When they change, those same refinements can become fragile points of failure. Central Asian ancestry. Central Asian ancestry spans the heart of Eurasia, shaped by nomadic pastoralism, harsh continental climates, and ancient trade routes. Populations such as Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, and Tajiks reflect a mosaic of East and West Eurasian lineages, forged through migration, isolation, and life on open steppe or high plateau. Several adaptations reveal subtle disadvantages when contexts shift. Milk digestion divides sharply along cultural lines. Pastoral nomads evolved high lactase persistence, while farming populations did not, making lactose intolerance common where modern dairy diets expand. Highland groups, especially Tibetans, carry unique oxygen regulation genes that prevent altitude sickness, yet may slightly limit hemoglobin levels at sea level, a trade-off between survival and performance. Clan-based social structure also amplified founder mutations, concentrating rare disorders within specific lineages. Even alcohol metabolism varies unpredictably, reflecting deep admixture rather than uniform ancestry. Central Asian genetics mirror movement and mixture. Their hidden disadvantages are not universal, but unevenly scattered, legacies of adaptation to extremes that no longer define everyday life. Slavic ancestry. Slavic ancestry spans the forests and plains of Eastern Europe, shaped by late expansion, harsh winters, and repeated demographic bottlenecks. Communities often endured famine, epidemics, and long periods of endogamy, allowing chance mutations to quietly persist as populations spread and rebuilt. Some of these mutations carry serious modern consequences. Distinct founder variants in BRCA1 dramatically raise risks of breast and ovarian cancer, not through adaptation, but through genetic drift amplified over centuries. Other inherited risks, like cystic fibrosis and alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, reflect mutations that may once have conferred resistance to infectious disease, yet now predispose children to lung and liver damage when both harmful copies are inherited. The immune system reveals another trade-off. Certain HLA patterns, common in Slavic populations, heighten protection against historic pathogens, but also raise susceptibility to autoimmune diseases such as type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis, especially in northern climates with limited sunlight. Even behavioral vulnerabilities appear shaped by biology. The absence of alcohol-deterring enzyme variants removes a natural brake on heavy drinking. Slavic genetics reflect endurance in marginal environments. But when survival no longer hinges on plague or cold, the traits that once lingered unnoticed can surface as modern burdens, legacies of resilience that demand new forms of awareness. African American ancestry. African American ancestry reflects a complex admixture shaped by the transatlantic slave trade, combining primarily West and Central African lineages with European and occasional Native American ancestry. This history preserved powerful African genetic adaptations, often removed from the environments in which they originally evolved. Several inherited traits now carry disproportionate costs. The sickle cell allele, once protective against malaria, persists without benefit and leaves a risk of severe inherited disease. A POL1 variant, protective against African parasites, now greatly increased susceptibility to kidney failure. G6PD deficiency remains largely silent until medications or illness trigger dangerous anemia. Cancer represents another quiet disadvantage. African Americans experience higher incidence and significantly higher mortality for many cancers, including breast, prostate, colorectal, and lung cancer. Genetics contributes through variants affecting tumor suppression, hormone metabolism, and inflammation, but late detection and aggressive disease biology compound the risk. For example, prostate cancer is both more common and more lethal in African American men, even when access to care is similar. Metabolic traits further add strain. Salt-sensitive blood pressure regulation raises rates of early hypertension and heart failure, while high genetic diversity complicates bone marrow donor matching. African American genetics reflect endurance under extraordinary pressure, but when history shifts, those same inheritances can become unseen liabilities. Celtic ancestry. Celtic ancestry traces to the Atlantic edges of Europe, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, regions shaped by low sunlight, frequent famine, and long periods of relative isolation. These conditions fostered distinctive genetic adaptations, some of which quietly persist as modern vulnerabilities. One of the most striking is hereditary hemochromatosis, driven by HFE mutation. Exceptionally common in Celtic populations, it promotes excessive iron absorption. What may once have protected against iron deficiency during famine now allows iron to accumulate silently for decades, damaging the liver, heart, and pancreas. Cystic fibrosis presents another legacy. Celtic regions have the world's highest carrier rates, likely because carriers once gained resistance to lethal infections, even though children who inherited both mutated copies faced devastating disease before modern treatment. Skin pigmentation reveals a further trade-off. MC1R variants, producing fair skin and red hair, maximized vitamin D synthesis under cloudy skies, but sharply increased susceptibility to skin cancer under stronger sun exposure. Immune genetics add complexity. High frequencies of HLA-DQ2 predispose Celtic populations to celiac disease, an autoimmune response to gluten introduced relatively late into their diet. Even small subgroups, such as Irish travelers, carry severe founder effect disorders like galactosemia. Celtic genetics reflect survival at the margins of Europe, but traits once tuned to scarcity and shadow can become liabilities in abundance and light. French-Canadian ancestry. French-Canadian ancestry, particularly in Quebec's Charlevoix and Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean regions, traces back to a remarkably small founding population of 17th century settlers. Geographic isolation, large family sizes, and centuries of limited migration allowed chance mutations to spread widely, creating one of the clearest examples of founder effects in human genetics. Several rare disorders reached unusually high frequencies. RSACS, a progressive neurological condition, emerges in early childhood with muscle stiffness, balance loss, and impaired coordination. Hereditary tyrosinemia type 1 reflects a metabolic failure to break down an amino acid, once causing fatal liver disease in infancy before modern treatments intervened. Other conditions, such as Anderman syndrome, disrupt both brain structure and peripheral nerves, while vitamin D-dependent rickets weakens growing bones despite adequate nutrition. Even more familiar diseases appear in distinct forms. Cystic fibrosis is common, but driven by Quebec-specific mutations rather than the variants seen elsewhere in Europe. None of these traits offered clear evolutionary advantage. They spread through isolation, not selection. French-Canadian genetics reveal how history can concentrate risk. A small beginning, echoed across generations, turned rare mutations into regional legacies. Quiet reminders that ancestry can shape health in highly local, deeply personal ways. Sardinian ancestry. Sardinian ancestry comes from an island that spent long stretches of history in relative isolation, shaped by harsh environmental pressures and limited outside mixing. Over generations, this created a distinct genetic profile, one where certain traits became far more common than in surrounding regions. Some of the most noticeable effects appear in the blood. Beta thalassemia is relatively frequent, a condition where the body struggles to produce healthy hemoglobin. In severe cases, this leads to chronic anemia and lifelong medical care. Another condition, G6PD deficiency, affects how red blood cells handle stress. Most of the time it stays hidden, but certain foods, illnesses, or medications can trigger sudden breakdown of red blood cells, leading to fatigue, jaundice, and tachycardia. Beyond blood-related traits, Sardinia also stands out for higher than expected rates of autoimmune diseases, like type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis. In these conditions, the immune system mistakenly attacks the body's own tissues, either insulin-producing beta cells or the nervous system. The deeper pattern is one of intensity. Sardinian genetics reflect a system shaped under pressure and reinforced by isolation. What once helped populations endure difficult conditions now appears as a clustering of vulnerabilities, reminding us that when evolution narrows its path, its effects can echo for generations. Germanic ancestry. Germanic ancestry spans much of northern and central Europe, shaped by farming societies, migration, and dense early populations. Over time, certain inherited traits became more common, not because they were perfect, but because they helped people survive in earlier conditions. One key example is factor V Leiden, a genetic change that affects how blood clots. Normally, the body has a balance between forming clots and breaking them down. With this variant, that balance tilts, making clots more likely to form, especially during triggers like long travel, surgery, or hormonal changes. In the past, slightly faster clotting may have helped prevent death from injuries or childbirth. Today, it can increase the risk of dangerous clots. Another trait is iron overload, caused by HFE gene variants. The body absorbs more iron than it needs, and over time, that iron builds up in organs like the liver and heart. What may have once helped during times of poor nutrition now becomes harmful in modern diets where iron is plentiful. There's also a quieter factor. Most people of this ancestry lack the alcohol flush response seen in some other populations. Without that built-in warning system, heavy drinking can feel easier, removing a natural limit. Germanic genetics reflect survival in a harsher past, but when scarcity fades, the systems built for it don't always turn off. Nordic ancestry. Nordic ancestry traces to the far north of Europe, regions shaped by long winters, limited sunlight, and extreme seasonal shifts. For much of the year, sunlight is scarce, meaning the body cannot rely on the skin to produce enough vitamin D. Over time, populations adapted not just physically, but immunologically to survive in these conditions. This led to what could be called a winter-tuned immune system, fast, reactive, and efficient against infections in cold, harsh environments. But in today's world, that same sensitivity can turn inward. Autoimmune conditions such as multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes appear at higher rates in these populations. In both cases, the immune system mistakenly attacks the body, either the nervous system or cells in the pancreas, like a defense system that can't always tell friend from foe. Light itself becomes another hidden factor. With months of darkness, circadian rhythms can drift, contributing to seasonal affective disorder, a recurring, winter-linked depression tied to disrupted sleep and hormone cycles. At the same time, low sunlight increases reliance on dietary vitamin D, creating a quiet but persistent deficiency risk. Nordic genetics reflect survival in darkness and cold, but when those conditions change, the same finely tuned systems can become overactive, revealing how adaptation can sometimes overshoot its mark. Basque ancestry. Basque ancestry traces to a unique population in the mountains between Spain and France, shaped by long periods of cultural and geographic isolation. Over time, this continuity preserved distinct genetic patterns, subtle differences that don't stand out day to day, but can influence certain health risks. One of the most notable traits is a high frequency of Rh negative blood type. On its own, this means nothing, but in pregnancy, it can create a mismatch if the baby is Rh positive. In earlier generations, this sometimes led to serious complications, as a mother's immune system could attack the baby's red blood cells. Today, modern medicine prevents this almost entirely, but the underlying genetic pattern remains. Other effects are quieter. Slightly reduced genetic diversity can make rare inherited conditions more likely to appear within certain families, not because of a specific disease, but because shared ancestry increases the odds of matching variants that negatively affect health. Lactose intolerance is also more common, reflecting a mixed history with dairy consumption. There are even subtle differences in blood clotting tendencies, which can matter under certain conditions like surgery or long travel. Basque genetics tell a story of continuity, but when populations remain stable for centuries, even ordinary traits can slowly concentrate, turning small probabilities into patterns that medicine eventually learns to recognize. Dutch ancestry. Dutch ancestry is often associated with one striking trait: height. The Netherlands is home to some of the tallest people in the world, shaped by a mix of genetics, nutrition, and environment. But height isn't just a visual trait, it changes how the entire body functions. Taller bodies come with longer bones and greater mechanical stress on joints. Over time, this can increase the risk of osteoarthritis, especially in the hips and knees, where more force is placed on cartilage with each step. What looks like strength can quietly become wear. Height also affects circulation. Blood has to travel a longer distance from the heart to the legs and back again. This can raise the risk of blood clots, particularly in the legs, especially during long periods of sitting or inactivity. The same principle extends to the heart itself. Larger body size is linked to a higher chance of atrial fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat that can increase stroke risk. Dutch genetics highlight a simple truth: even beneficial traits come with trade-offs. Height can be an advantage in strength and presence, but inside the body, it asks more from every system that supports it. Italian ancestry. Northern and central Italian ancestry reflects a region of dense cities, long agricultural history, and strong regional genetic patterns. Over time, certain health traits became common enough to shape national awareness, often quietly, without obvious symptoms. One of the most notable is celiac disease, which appears at relatively high rates in Italy. This condition causes the immune system to react to gluten, slowly damaging the small intestine. In many cases, it goes unnoticed for years, showing up only as fatigue, anemia, or mild digestive issues. In Italy, it became common enough to justify large-scale screening, revealing how something once considered rare was actually widespread. Another hidden factor is blood clotting risk. Variants like factor V Leiden and prothrombin mutations can increase the chance of clots, especially during triggers like surgery, pregnancy, or long travel. On their own, they often remain invisible. Cholesterol tells a similar story. Certain inherited forms of high cholesterol can run through families, raising heart disease risk from an early age without clear warning signs. At the same time, some individuals experience lactose intolerance, reflecting regional dietary history. Italian genetics reveal a pattern of quiet accumulation, where conditions don't always appear dramatic, but build slowly beneath the surface, only becoming visible when modern life brings them into focus. Celtic ancestry. Celtic ancestry traces to the Atlantic edges of Europe, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, regions shaped by low sunlight, frequent famine, and long periods of relative isolation. These conditions fostered distinctive genetic adaptations, some of which quietly persist as modern vulnerabilities. One of the most striking is hereditary hemochromatosis, driven by HFE mutation. Exceptionally common in Celtic populations, it promotes excessive iron absorption. What may once have protected against iron deficiency during famine now allows iron to accumulate silently for decades, damaging the liver, heart, and pancreas. Cystic fibrosis presents another legacy. Celtic regions have the world's highest carrier rates, likely because carriers once gained resistance to lethal infections, even though children who inherited both mutated copies faced devastating disease before modern treatment. Skin pigmentation reveals a further trade-off. MC1R variants, producing fair skin and red hair, maximized vitamin D synthesis under cloudy skies, but sharply increased susceptibility to skin cancer under stronger sun exposure. Immune genetics add complexity. High frequencies of HLA-DQ2 predispose Celtic populations to celiac disease, an autoimmune response to gluten introduced relatively late into their diet. Even small subgroups, such as Irish travelers, carry severe founder effect disorders like galactosemia. Celtic genetics reflect survival at the margins of Europe, but traits once tuned to scarcity and shadow can become liabilities in abundance and light. Finnish ancestry. Finnish ancestry offers one of the clearest examples of how history can quietly reshape genetics. For long periods, Finland's population remained small and relatively isolated. When only a limited number of ancestors contribute to future generations, rare genetic traits can become more common simply by chance. This pattern is known as the Finnish disease heritage. The result is a higher occurrence of certain rare inherited conditions. One example is congenital nephrotic syndrome, a severe kidney disorder that can appear at birth. It affects the body's ability to filter blood properly, leading to serious complications early in life. Another is aspartyl glucosineminuria, a condition that disrupts the body's ability to break down cellular waste, gradually affecting brain function and development. What makes Finland unique is not just individual diseases, but the pattern itself. Multiple rare conditions, almost invisible elsewhere, appear more frequently within this population due to shared ancestry and genetic drift. Finnish genetics tell a quiet story of chance, not adaptation or selection, but the echo of a small beginning where rare traits simply had more room to grow. Slavic ancestry. Slavic ancestry spans the forests and plains of Eastern Europe, shaped by late expansion, harsh winters, and repeated demographic bottlenecks. Communities often endured famine, epidemics, and long periods of endogamy, allowing chance mutations to quietly persist as populations spread and rebuilt. Some of these mutations carry serious modern consequences. Distinct founder variants in BRCA1 dramatically raise risks of breast and ovarian cancer, not through adaptation, but through genetic drift amplified over centuries. Other inherited risks, like cystic fibrosis and alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, reflect mutations that may once have conferred resistance to infectious disease, yet now predispose children to lung and liver damage when both harmful copies are inherited. The immune system reveals another trade-off. Certain HLA patterns, common in Slavic populations, heighten protection against historic pathogens, but also raise susceptibility to autoimmune diseases such as type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis, especially in northern climates with limited sunlight. Even behavioral vulnerabilities appear shaped by biology. The absence of alcohol-deterring enzyme variants removes a natural brake on heavy drinking. Slavic genetics reflect endurance in marginal environments. But when survival no longer hinges on plague or cold, the traits that once lingered unnoticed can surface as modern burdens, legacies of resilience that demand new forms of awareness. Iberian ancestry. Iberian ancestry stretches across Spain and Portugal, shaped by coastal living, regional isolation, and centuries of migration between mainland and islands. This mix created pockets where certain genetic traits became more visible, especially in smaller or more isolated communities. One of the most striking examples is Machado-Joseph disease, a rare neurological disorder found at unusually high rates in parts of Portuguese island populations like the Azores. It develops slowly in adulthood, affecting balance, coordination, and movement as specific brain cells begin to fail over time. Other traits are quieter, but still important. G6PD deficiency appears in parts of Iberia, where red blood cells can break down under certain stresses like illness or medications. Familial hypercholesterolemia is also well studied in this region, a condition that raises cholesterol from a young age, increasing the risk of early heart disease if untreated. There is also a more subtle vulnerability in the liver. Variants in the PNPLA3 gene can make it easier for fat to build up in liver cells, especially when combined with modern diets, alcohol, or metabolic stress. Iberian genetics reflect both movement and isolation, where some traits spread widely, while others stayed concentrated, quietly shaping risk across generations. Alpine ancestry. Alpine ancestry comes from populations shaped by life in the mountains, cold climates, isolated valleys, and environments where geography quietly influenced health. In these regions, the land itself played a powerful role in shaping biological risk. One of the most important historical challenges was iodine deficiency. Mountain soils often lacked iodine, and without it, the thyroid struggles to produce essential hormones. This led to widespread goiter, an enlarged thyroid, and in severe cases, developmental problems in children. Today, iodized salt has largely solved this issue, but the underlying vulnerability remains. Without careful nutrition, deficiency can return. Altitude adds another layer. At higher elevations, oxygen levels are lower, and the body must constantly adjust. This can disrupt breathing during sleep, causing cycles where breathing speeds up and then briefly stops. Over time, low oxygen can also increase pressure in the lungs, placing strain on the heart. These are not dramatic, visible traits, but quiet physiological pressures shaped by environment. Alpine ancestry shows how geography can leave a lasting imprint, not necessarily through a single gene, but through the conditions people lived in, where even the air, the soil, and the altitude became part of the body's long story. Polish ancestry. Polish ancestry carries one of the clearest examples of how family history can quietly shape modern health. In Poland, certain inherited BRCA1 mutations became common enough that they are now part of routine cancer screening. These mutations damage the body's ability to repair broken DNA, which raises the lifetime risk of breast and ovarian cancer and can cause disease to appear earlier across generations. Cancer risk in Poland also has an older environmental layer. Stomach cancer has long been influenced by a mix of infection, salted foods, and family exposure patterns. So the danger is not always a single gene. Sometimes it is an inherited setting where biology, diet, and microbes work together over time. Beyond cancer, there is a broader background pressure, heart disease. Like much of Central and Eastern Europe, Poland has carried a heavy burden of high blood pressure, cholesterol, and cardiovascular illness. These risks often stay silent for years, then appear suddenly as heart attack or stroke. Polish genetics reveal a pattern of hidden inheritance. Some risks arrive through specific mutations. Others build slowly through shared family biology and environment, quiet for decades until they are no longer quiet at all. Icelandic ancestry. Icelandic ancestry comes from a small group of settlers who arrived over 1,000 years ago and remained relatively isolated on a remote island. Over time, this created a population where certain rare genetic traits became easier to trace, and, in some cases, more common. Iceland is often studied because its detailed family records make these patterns unusually visible. One of the clearest examples is a specific BRCA2 mutation linked to higher risks of breast, ovarian, and prostate cancer. Because this mutation traces back to a common ancestor, it appears more frequently in Iceland than in many other populations. The result is not just increased risk, but clear family patterns, where multiple relatives may face similar diagnoses across generations. This visibility extends beyond cancer. Founder effects can make inherited conditions, including some heart and psychiatric risks, easier to detect within family lines. For example, certain variants linked to high cholesterol or mental health conditions appear more clearly in research because of shared ancestry. The underlying theme is amplification. In a small population, rare traits don't stay rare. They become easier to see, track, and sometimes inherit. Icelandic genetics show how isolation can sharpen patterns, turning hidden risks into visible legacies carried through generations. Mediterranean ancestry. Mediterranean ancestry spans the sunlit coasts of southern Europe, the Levant, and North Africa, regions shaped by early agriculture, dense cities, and centuries of infectious pressure. Life in these environments forged a distinctive genetic landscape, one tuned to malaria, famine, and epidemic disease long before modern medicine arrived. Several hidden disadvantages emerged from these ancient defenses. Traits like beta thalassemia and G6PD deficiency spread because they disrupted malaria's life cycle inside red blood cells. Yet outside that context, they reveal costs: chronic anemia, deadly food allergies, and dangerous medication reactions. Similarly, mutations behind familial Mediterranean fever likely sharpened immune vigilance against historic plagues, but now trigger painful, recurring inflammation that requires lifelong management. Other trade-offs are quieter. Lower lactose tolerance reflects dairy practices centered on fermentation rather than fresh milk. Variants affecting skin pigmentation, while subtle, can increase vulnerability to ultraviolet damage under intense Mediterranean sun. Each reflects adaptation to a precise historical niche. Mediterranean genetics tell a story of survival through adversity, but when threats fade, the protections they shaped remain, sometimes as burdens, echoing battles no longer fought. Baltic ancestry. Baltic ancestry comes from Northern Europe, where long, dark winters and short daylight hours shape daily life. For months each year, sunlight is limited, and that has real effects on the body, especially when it comes to vitamin production and overall health. One of the most common issues is vitamin D deficiency. Without enough sunlight, the body struggles to produce this essential nutrient, which affects bones, immunity, and even mood. During winter, levels can drop significantly unless diet or supplements make up the difference. At a broader level, the region shows some of the highest heart disease rates in Europe. This isn't caused by a single gene, but by a combination of factors: blood pressure, cholesterol, diet, and long-term stress patterns. High rates of hypertension place constant strain on the heart and blood vessels, increasing the risk of heart attacks and stroke over time. Lifestyle factors can add to this burden. Alcohol use, historically higher in the region, can worsen blood pressure and heart rhythm issues. At the same time, long winter darkness can disrupt sleep and mood, adding another layer of strain. Baltic ancestry reveals how environment and habit can stack together, not through one dramatic trait, but through many small pressures that over time shape the body's overall risk. Balkan ancestry. Balkan ancestry reflects a crossroads of civilizations shaped by Slavic migrations, Mediterranean influence, and centuries of life in rugged, mountainous terrain. Geography fragmented populations into isolated valleys and villages, where small communities persisted for generations with limited outside mixing. This history left a genetic landscape rich in diversity at the regional level, yet unusually concentrated within local enclaves. Several hidden disadvantages arise from this pattern. Malaria once reached Balkan wetlands, favoring the spread of thalassemia traits and, at lower levels, sickle cell variants. These genes protected carriers, but still carry the risk of severe inherited anemia when combined. Isolation also amplified chance mutations. Founder effects caused rare recessive disorders to become unexpectedly common in specific ethnic or village groups, from metabolic conditions to childhood muscular dystrophies. Endogamy, when two people from the same small community have children, further increased the likelihood that silent mutations would meet. In some rural communities, this raised rates of congenital deafness and developmental disorders. Other vulnerabilities were tightly bound to place itself. Genetic sensitivity to local environmental toxins contributed to Balkan endemic nephropathy, a kidney disease once confined to particular farming regions. Balkan genetics reveal how history can narrow choice. When populations remain small and still, chance leaves a heavier mark, turning geography into destiny and inheritance into an echo of long-forgotten isolation. Romani ancestry. Romani ancestry traces back to a migration from South Asia into Europe over 1,000 years ago, followed by the formation of many distinct subgroups. Because some communities remained relatively small or socially isolated, certain genetic traits became more concentrated over time. The key detail is that these patterns vary widely. There is no single Roma genetic profile, but rather many subgroup-specific ones. One clear example is a congenital myasthenic syndrome found in some Romani groups. This condition affects how nerves communicate with muscles. Signals are sent normally, but the muscle response weakens quickly, leading to fatigue, drooping eyelids, and difficulty with movement. With proper diagnosis, some treatments can improve function, but without awareness, it can remain misunderstood. More broadly, founder effects have created clusters of rare inherited disorders within certain Romani subgroups. These are often recessive conditions, meaning they appear when two parents of the same rare gene have a child. In smaller or closely connected communities, this becomes more likely. Alongside this, modern health challenges, like higher rates of metabolic conditions, often reflect environment, access, and lifestyle as much as genetics. Romani genetics tell a story of movement and separation, and in that separation, rare traits can gather, turning quiet variations into patterns that medicine is only beginning to fully map. Eastern Steppe ancestry. Ukrainian and Eastern Steppe ancestry comes from a region shaped by vast plains, cold winters, and periods of intense social and economic stress. Here, the hidden disadvantages are less about a single gene and more about how environment, lifestyle, and biology combine over time. The most significant pattern is cardiovascular disease. This region has some of the highest rates of heart-related deaths in the world. Conditions like heart attacks and strokes are often driven by long-term factors, especially high blood pressure, which quietly damages blood vessels in the heart over many years before symptoms appear. Another layer is vitamin D deficiency. With long winters and limited sunlight, the body produces less of this essential nutrient, affecting bone health and potentially weakening overall resilience. At the same time, modern lifestyle pressures, diet changes, stress, and reduced activity can increase the risk of metabolic conditions like diabetes. Alcohol also plays a role, not as a genetic trait, but as a strong environmental factor that can amplify existing risks, especially for the heart and liver. Ukrainian ancestry reflects a broader truth. Sometimes the greatest disadvantages are not written in a single gene, but in the steady buildup of small pressures, where biology and environment meet, and health is shaped over a lifetime. Scottish ancestry. Highland Scottish ancestry comes from one of Europe's most light-limited environments, marked by long winters, heavy cloud cover, and dramatic seasonal shifts in daylight. Over generations, the body adapted to survive in low sunlight, but that adaptation comes with quiet trade-offs in modern life. One of the most persistent is vitamin D deficiency, With limited UV exposure for much of the year, the body cannot produce enough vitamin D through sunlight alone. This creates a reliance on diet or supplements, and without them, bone health, immunity, and overall energy can suffer. Light itself also affects the mind. Long, dark winters can disrupt sleep cycles and hormone rhythms, increasing the risk of seasonal depression. This is more than mood. It reflects how deeply the body depends on light to stay balanced. Other risks build more slowly. Iron overload, linked to common Northern European genes, can quietly damage organs over time if undetected. And without natural biological deterrents to alcohol, environmental habits can more easily shape long-term health outcomes. Scottish Highland genetics reflect life under constant gray skies, but when light becomes scarce, the body must work harder to stay balanced, revealing how even something as simple as sunlight can shape health across generations. Venezuelan ancestry. Venezuelan ancestry spans a wide mix of indigenous, European, and African roots, but along the shores of Lake Maracaibo in Zulia, a more concentrated history took shape. In isolated fishing villages, large extended families grew over generations, creating one of the most striking examples of how geography and lineage can quietly amplify a single genetic variant. Here, Huntington's disease appears at an unusually high frequency. It's caused by an expanded repeat in the HTT gene. Over time, it gradually damages the brain circuits that control movement, mood, and thinking. Early signs can be subtle: restlessness, mood changes, but as the disease progresses, involuntary movements, memory loss, and loss of independence become unavoidable, turning ordinary motion into effort and then dependence. This is not an inherited advantage, but a founder effect, one ancestral mutation carried forward through tightly connected communities, where location itself becomes a risk. The burden extends beyond biology. Because Huntington's is autosomal dominant, each child of an affected parent faces a 1 in 2 chance of inheriting the condition, shaping family decisions, silence, and stigma across generations. In diaspora settings, that history can be obscured, delaying recognition until symptoms have already begun. In this case, risk is written less in ancestry than in place in lineage. The mutation doesn't disappear, it waits and then returns. Colombian ancestry. Colombian ancestry spans a wide geographic and genetic range, from Andean highlands to Caribbean coasts, shaped by indigenous foundations, Spanish colonization, and African diaspora. These layers did not blend evenly. Instead, they formed regional pockets, where certain traits, protective or harmful, could become concentrated within families over generations. In Antioquia, a large extended family network carries an inherited mutation in the PSEN1 gene that causes early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Symptoms can begin decades earlier than expected, with memory loss and cognitive decline appearing in what should be midlife. The mutation disrupts how proteins are handled in the brain, speeding degeneration far earlier than in typical Alzheimer's. Over generations, this mutation became concentrated within interconnected families, affecting entire family lines rather than isolated individuals. As a result, this region has become one of the most closely studied Alzheimer's populations in the world. Certain BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations also appear more frequently in some Colombian lineages, where impaired DNA repair raises the risk of breast and ovarian cancers. Broader admixture adds another layer. In some regions, African ancestry contributes to variants linked to kidney disease risk, while indigenous ancestry can influence lipid metabolism, increasing susceptibility to fatty liver as diets shift. These influences do not act uniformly. They depend on where families come from and how their environments have changed. What appears to be chance begins to look predictable once the family line is fully traced. Navajo ancestry. The Navajo trace their ancestry to Athabascan-speaking peoples who settled the high, arid plateaus of the American Southwest, adapting to scarce water, wide distances, and a demanding climate. Their history includes forced displacement during the Long Walk and later exposure to mining economies, leaving communities both geographically isolated and shaped by population bottlenecks that can amplify rare inherited conditions. Two inherited disorders stand out because of how consistently they appear within certain families. Artemis severe combined immunodeficiency, caused by a genetic mutation, prevents the immune system from developing properly, leaving infants without the T-cell defenses needed to fight even routine infections. Navajo neurohepatopathy, also linked to mutations in the MPV17 gene, disrupts mitochondrial DNA maintenance, impairing energy production in the liver and nervous system and leading to severe, often early life illness. These conditions persist not because they offer any advantage, but because of shared ancestry within relatively isolated communities. where rare variants can be passed down and become more visible over time. A different layer of risk comes from the environment. Legacy uranium and arsenic exposure from mining can place chronic stress on kidneys and development, especially when combined with dehydration and limited access to healthcare in a dry climate. Here, vulnerability reflects both inheritance and exposure, where long-standing genetic patterns intersect with more recent environmental pressures. Cuban ancestry. Cuban ancestry grew out of the layered history of the island itself, Spanish colonization, African diaspora, and the surviving imprint of indigenous Caribbean ancestry. That history did not leave a single medical signature. Instead, it produced a mosaic, with some risks spread broadly and others concentrated so tightly in particular regions and families that they remain invisible until symptoms begin. In eastern Cuba, especially around Holguin, certain family lines carry spinocerebellar ataxia type 2. Caused by an expanded repeat in the ataxia gene, it gradually breaks down the systems that control balance, eye movement, speech, and coordination. Movements that once felt automatic become unstable. Walking requires effort. Speech slows. Over time, even basic coordination becomes difficult to maintain. This pattern reflects how a rare mutation can become concentrated within a specific region and its family networks, where it is passed down across generations. A different risk can appear through inherited European ancestry. In HFE-related iron overload, the body absorbs more iron than it needs, often for years without symptoms, until damage begins to affect the liver, heart, or pancreas. Some risks are quieter, but still present. Hemoglobin variants remain clinically relevant in certain families, while migration can obscure these patterns when medical histories are reduced to broad ethnic labels without attention to regional origin. Some conditions remain hidden until they surface within the same families, in the same places, generation after generation. Puerto Rican ancestry. Puerto Rican ancestry formed at the crossroads of empire and survival, where indigenous Caribbean communities, Spanish colonists, and enslaved Africans were brought together on a humid, storm-battered island. In towns that often remained locally rooted, this tri-continental mixture created both rich genetic diversity and tightly clustered lineages, allowing rare variants carried by a few individuals to expand quietly over generations. One example is Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome, which appears at unusually high frequency in certain regions because early carriers pass the mutation through closely connected communities. It affects structures inside cells that act like recycling centers, leading to reduced pigmentation, fragile blood clotting, and in some forms, progressive lung scarring that gradually makes breathing more difficult. A separate risk appears in a Puerto Rican founder mutation in BRCA2, a gene responsible for repairing damaged DNA. When that repair system is impaired, errors accumulate, increasing lifetime risk of breast and ovarian cancers. Some risks are less concentrated, but still important. Asthma appears at high rates, shaped by immune sensitivity interacting with mold, pollution, and viral exposures. Diabetes reflects a similar interaction, where metabolic traits meet modern diets, rich in processed foods, and more sedentary routines. Even diagnosis can fall short when simplified racial categories overlook this layered ancestry. Puerto Rican ancestry reflects both diversity and concentration, where widely shared risks and highly localized ones exist side by side. What matters most is not just ancestry itself, but how precisely it is understood. Brazilian Pardo ancestry. Brazilian Pardo ancestry emerged from centuries of forced migration, colonization, indigenous continuity, and later settlement, bringing together Portuguese, African, Native American, and sometimes Japanese lineages into one of the most layered genetic landscapes in the Americas. Across rainforests, coasts, plantations, and inland frontiers, traits shaped by malaria, famine, and regional isolation were carried forward into a very different medical environment. Some of the clearest examples appear in hemoglobin disorders. Sickle cell trait persisted because carrying a single copy offered protection against severe malaria, while two copies can lead to sickle cell disease, where red blood cells stiffen under low oxygen, damaging blood vessels, lungs, and the brain. Thalassemias follow a related pattern. Reduced hemoglobin production may have once offered an advantage, but today can result in chronic anemia, repeated transfusions, and iron overload. In some Japanese Brazilian lineages, ALDH2 variants slow the breakdown of acetaldehyde, making alcohol both immediately uncomfortable and, over time, more carcinogenic. Another inherited condition, G6PD deficiency, leaves red blood cells more vulnerable to oxidative stress, which can be triggered by infections, certain medications, or even specific foods like fava beans. Brazilian Pardo ancestry reflects the layering of multiple evolutionary pressures, where traits shaped in very different environments now coexist within the same population. What once provided protection in one setting can create vulnerability in another. Barbadian ancestry. Barbadian ancestry was shaped on a small Caribbean island marked by British colonial rule, plantation labor, and the forced migration of West Africans. In that confined setting, where communities grew from relatively small lineages and later spread through migration, older pathogen pressures now intersect with modern chronic disease in ways that are easy to miss. A key part of that story is APOL1. These kidney risk variants were inherited from African ancestors because they provided protection against deadly trypanosome infections. But in the present, carrying two high-risk copies can turn that earlier advantage into a long-term vulnerability. The cells responsible for filtering blood in the kidneys become more susceptible to damage, increasing the likelihood of scarring diseases and, over time, chronic kidney failure. That risk can be intensified by other factors. Hypertension, which is common across the Caribbean, places constant pressure on kidney blood vessels. When it overlaps with APOL1-related risk, the progression toward kidney damage can accelerate. Diagnosis can also be complicated. Broad racial labels in U.S. healthcare settings may obscure Caribbean-specific ancestry, delaying the kind of screening or counseling that could identify risk earlier. Barbadian ancestry reflects a clear evolutionary trade-off. What once helped survival can carry long-term consequences in a different environment. Mexican-American ancestry. Mexican-American ancestry often traces to the meeting of indigenous Mesoamerican societies and Spanish colonization, shaped over centuries of farming cycles, periodic scarcity, and maize-centered diets, rather than dairy pastoralism. In these environments, energy efficiency and resilience to fluctuating food supply were valuable, shaped under infectious pressure and physically demanding living. A well-studied example is a type 2 diabetes-associated variant, which changes how cells handle lipids, increasing metabolic strain when calories are abundant. In earlier conditions, this shift may have been neutral or even useful, but in a setting of constant sugar and processed food, it can push the body toward insulin resistance. Changes in cholesterol handling add another layer. Variants can reduce the formation of protective HDL particles, contributing to lower HDL levels and higher metabolic risk, even though they may have been favored in earlier populations. Liver metabolism can also be affected. A genetic variant increases susceptibility to fatty liver disease, especially as diets become more calorie-dense. Mexican-American ancestry highlights that small differences in how cells process nutrients can lead to much larger effects across the body. Peruvian ancestry. Peruvian mestizo ancestry reflects a long history of life across extremes. Indigenous Andean populations adapted to thin air at high altitude, later blending with Spanish settlers across mountains, deserts, and forests. In the Andes, survival meant extracting oxygen from scarce air, sustaining pregnancies in low oxygen conditions, and maintaining energy balance in harsh, variable environments. One result of that history appears in chronic mountain sickness. At high elevations, the body produces more red blood cells to carry oxygen, an essential adjustment in thin air. In some individuals, however, this response overshoots, thickening the blood and placing strain on the heart and lungs, leading to fatigue, headaches, and increased risk of stroke. Pregnancy adds another layer. While Andean adaptations can improve blood flow to the placenta, altitude still raises the risk of complications, especially when modern stressors disrupt those protective patterns. A different kind of risk emerges outside the mountains. A PNPLA3 variant, found at high frequency in some Peruvian populations, changes how the liver processes fat, increasing susceptibility to fatty liver disease as diets become more calorie-dense. Urban migration can intensify this shift, as metabolic systems adapted for scarcity meet constant abundance. Peruvian ancestry reflects adaptations that help survival at altitude can create unexpected risks in different environments. Mayan ancestry. Mayan ancestry spans a constellation of indigenous peoples across Central America, shaped by long histories of agriculture, cultural continuity, and communities that often remained locally rooted across generations. In many regions, that continuity created tightly connected family networks where both traditions and rare genetic variants could persist over time. In one documented case, a deletion in the GJB2 gene, essential for inner ear function, led to congenital hearing loss within a Mayan family. When this gene is disrupted, sound signals cannot be properly transmitted, and hearing loss is present from birth. Conditions like this do not spread broadly across populations. Instead, they can remain concentrated within specific families, only becoming visible when two carriers pass the variant on to a child. This reflects how small community structure and endogamy can shape inheritance. Variants that are rare globally can persist quietly within a local group, carried across generations without being recognized. Other health patterns are shaped more by changing conditions than single genes. As diets and lifestyles shift, diabetes and hypertension have increased in some Maya populations, while lactase non-persistence can make dairy-heavy diets difficult to tolerate. In Maya communities, risk often emerges within families rather than across entire populations. What is rare globally can become familiar within a single lineage. Mapuche ancestry. Mapuche ancestry is rooted in the temperate forests and coastal regions of southern Chile and Argentina, where communities lived for generations, with distinct food systems, mobility patterns, and social structures. Despite colonization and displacement, many Mapuche lineages remained regionally continuous, shaping patterns of health that are now visible in modern populations. A well-documented pattern is an elevated risk of gallbladder cancer in individuals with higher proportions of Mapuche ancestry in Chile. This risk often begins with gallstones, hardened deposits that form when bile becomes oversaturated with cholesterol. In many Mapuche-descended groups, gallstones are unusually common, increasing the likelihood of chronic inflammation in the gallbladder. Over time, that repeated irritation can lead to cellular changes that raise the risk of cancer, often detected late. Several factors can push this process further. Diets higher in processed foods can increase cholesterol imbalance and stone formation, while limited access to early surgical care may delay removal of high-risk gallbladders. In diaspora settings, this pattern can also be missed when ancestry is reduced to broad categories like Latino. Mapuche ancestry highlights how risk can develop through a sequence of small steps rather than a single cause. The danger is not immediate. It builds up quietly, one step at a time. Ojibwe ancestry. Ojibwe ancestry is rooted in the Great Lakes region, where communities lived for generations in forested environments shaped by long winters, seasonal food systems, and strong local continuity. In some communities that remained relatively small and closely connected, rare inherited conditions became more visible over time. In related Oji-Cree populations, certain neurological disorders appear at higher frequency than expected. These include conditions that affect early development, where children may experience delays in movement, learning, or coordination. Some are leukodystrophies, where the protective covering around nerves gradually breaks down, impairing walking, speech, vision, and cognition over time. While each condition is rare on its own, their visibility increases in settings where the same variants are carried within connected family networks. In some cases, specific inherited disorders, such as Fabry disease, have been identified, where early symptoms like burning pain in the hands and feet can later progress to kidney, heart, or neurological complications. This pattern does not reflect a single mutation or a single disease. Instead, it reflects how rarity can cluster and become recognizable within a community. Ojibwe ancestry highlights how population structure shapes what becomes visible. Rarity changes meaning when it is shared within the same community. Cherokee ancestry. Cherokee ancestry is rooted in the southeastern United States, shaped by agricultural lifeways and later disrupted by forced removal along the Trail of Tears. In the generations that followed, communities rebuilt across Oklahoma and beyond, carrying both continuity and the effects of rapid environmental and social change. One of the clearest patterns is how early type 2 diabetes can begin. When elevated blood sugar appears in adolescence or young adulthood, the body is exposed to decades of metabolic strain. Over time, this increases the likelihood of complications such as kidney damage, nerve injury, and vision loss much earlier in life than expected. This is not driven by a single gene, but by how metabolic systems respond to changing diets, reduced physical activity, and long-term stress. Gallbladder disease adds another layer. Gallstones are more common in many indigenous populations, particularly among women, and can lead to inflammation or, in rare cases, more serious complications. A less visible challenge comes from how data is organized. In many healthcare systems, Cherokee individuals are grouped into broad American Indian, Alaska Native categories. That can obscure community-specific patterns and make it harder to track which risks and which interventions apply locally. Cherokee ancestry highlights how timing and classification both matter. When risk starts earlier but remains poorly defined, it becomes harder to stop. Yanomami ancestry. Yanomami ancestry is rooted in the Amazon rainforest along the Brazil-Venezuela border, where semi-isolated villages sustained life through forest-based diets, low salt intake, and minimal exposure to many outside pathogens. For most of their history, health risks were shaped by that environment. In recent decades, however, contact with outside populations, industries, and medical systems has introduced entirely new pressures. Viral hepatitis is one of the most serious. Studies in Yanomami communities have found widespread markers of hepatitis B and D infection, reflecting transmission in settings where vaccination and consistent care are difficult to maintain. These infections can progress quietly over years, eventually leading to liver scarring, cirrhosis, and cancer. Environmental exposure adds another layer. Mercury used in illegal gold mining contaminates rivers and food sources, and testing has found widespread exposure in Yanomami villages. As a neurotoxin, methylmercury can impair brain development, especially in children. Some risks only appear when modern treatment is introduced. Variants in multiple genes affect how certain medications are processed, and reduced activity can cause toxic buildup, leading to severe bone marrow suppression if standard doses are used. Yanomami ancestry highlights a different kind of vulnerability. In this case, exposure, not inheritance, becomes the defining risk. Dominican ancestry. Dominican ancestry reflects a Caribbean blend of Spanish, West African, and indigenous Taíno roots, with many families now living in diaspora communities, such as New York City. In clinical settings, this ancestry can be misunderstood, particularly when broad labels like Latino are used without considering underlying genetic variation. One important example is sickle cell trait. In some Dominican populations, carrier rates are high enough that two individuals without symptoms can still have a child with sickle cell disease. Because hemoglobin disorders are not always expected in Latino patients, screening may be delayed or overlooked, allowing risk to go unrecognized until complications appear. At the same time, many Dominican families are affected by high and rising rates of type 2 diabetes. When combined with hypertension, this increases the likelihood of kidney and cardiovascular disease over time, particularly when access to consistent care is limited. These patterns do not act independently. When inherited risk, expectations in clinical practice, and barriers to care intersect, conditions that are manageable can become more difficult to control. Dominican ancestry highlights how assumptions shape outcomes. What is overlooked is often what causes the most harm. Indo-Caribbean ancestry. Indo-Caribbean ancestry traces to South Asian indentured laborers brought to Guyana, Trinidad, and neighboring regions after emancipation, later blending with Caribbean environments and communities. Across generations, this history carried forward a metabolic profile shaped under very different nutritional conditions than those found today in diaspora settings. A key pattern is a form of diabetes risk that can remain hidden in plain sight. Individuals may appear relatively lean, yet carry higher levels of fat around internal organs, especially in the liver, which drives insulin resistance and earlier onset of type 2 diabetes. Because outward appearance does not always reflect this risk, it can go unrecognized until complications begin. Heart disease often follows a similar path. Imbalances in cholesterol, combined with long-term metabolic strain, can accelerate the buildup of plaque in arteries, increasing the likelihood of heart attacks at younger ages than expected. Additional inherited factors add complexity. Thalassemia trait, more common in South Asian lineages, is usually silent but becomes important in family planning when two carriers are involved. Medication response can also vary, meaning standard doses may not always match how the body processes certain drugs. In this ancestry, risk is often not visible on the surface. What appears healthy can still carry underlying strain that builds over time. French-Canadian ancestry. French-Canadian ancestry, particularly in Quebec's Charlevoix and Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean regions, traces back to a remarkably small founding population of 17th century settlers. Geographic isolation, large family sizes, and centuries of limited migration allowed chance mutations to spread widely, creating one of the clearest examples of founder effects in human genetics. Several rare disorders reach unusually high frequencies. RSACS, a progressive neurological condition, emerges in early childhood with muscle stiffness, balance loss, and impaired coordination. Hereditary tyrosinemia type 1 reflects a metabolic failure to break down an amino acid, once causing fatal liver disease in infancy before modern treatments intervened. Other conditions, such as Anderman syndrome, disrupt both brain structure and peripheral nerves, while vitamin D-dependent rickets weakens growing bones despite adequate nutrition. Even more familiar diseases appear in distinct forms. Cystic fibrosis is common, but driven by Quebec-specific mutations, rather than the variants seen elsewhere in Europe. None of these traits offered clear evolutionary advantage. They spread through isolation, not selection. French-Canadian genetics reveal how history can concentrate risk. A small beginning, echoed across generations, turned rare mutations into regional legacies. Quiet reminders that ancestry can shape health in highly local, deeply personal ways. Métis ancestry. Métis ancestry formed through the meeting of First Nations communities and European settlers across North America, creating distinct populations shaped by mobility, trade networks, and later displacement. Today, one of the less visible challenges is not only biological, it's informational. Compared with other populations, Métis communities are often underrepresented in large genetic and medical data sets. That gap can affect how risk is recognized and how treatment decisions are made. In pharmacogenetics, for example, differences in how individuals process certain medications may not be fully captured, making standard dosing less precise or harder to interpret. Health patterns still emerge, but they are often studied with less resolution. Rates of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease are elevated in many contexts, driven by a combination of metabolic stress, changing diets, and unequal access to preventive care. These conditions tend to cluster together, increasing long-term strain on the heart, blood vessels, and metabolic systems. Even dietary guidance can be inconsistent. Mixed ancestry means lactase persistence varies, so recommendations built around high dairy intake may not work well for everyone. Métis ancestry highlights a different kind of disadvantage, one where gaps in data and representation can shape outcomes alongside biology. Here, the absence of data can become a risk in itself. Hope you enjoyed this series learning about different genetic ancestries. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want to learn more, check out these other videos.